And between that contract date and the nomination date, what a lot of developers don't actually realise is if they take any steps to develop the land, they could be imposed with double stamp duty.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to episode 88 of the Property Developer Podcast. Thanks for joining me. How are you doing? Doing well? I'm doing great. Coming off a few weeks break and feeling refreshed, recharged and re-energized for the year ahead. It's been nice to have some time off and now I'm looking forward to another productive year. And I've got lots of great shows planned for you to help take your developing to the next level. So be sure to stick around. Hopefully my current project will be finished before the year is out. And speaking of that project, I don't really have a great deal to report as not much has happened on site in the past month due to the summer holiday period. But things have started back up again now and the initial site works are getting underway. Fingers crossed that we don't have any significant interruptions during the year. But if the past 2 years have taught me anything, it's to be ready to deal with the unexpected until this pandemic recedes. One of the goals I've set for myself this year is to release my book on property developing. I've actually spent the past few months finalising the manuscript and I'm now in the final stages of getting it ready for release, which is pretty exciting for me. So stay tuned for more news about that in the coming months. And it seems plenty of people have decided to make 2022 the year that they take a big step forward with their goal of getting into property development. Because heaps of people have signed up to the property developer training in the past month or so. And a big thank you to them for doing that. It's very exciting to see so many people taking charge of their futures and going after their dreams. It's never too late to get started, so if you would like to learn how to develop property, then head over to www.propertydevelopertraining.com and check out everything that's included in the course. It's all online and self-paced, so you can do the modules at your convenience. I have wrapped up all the lessons I've learned from my own projects, along with all the best tips from my guests over the years, into an easy-to-consume course. I'd love to see you inside the training, so take a look if you're ready to take that step into property development. Remember, you can always catch me on Insta and Facebook for my latest project updates and other developing news under the handle of Property Developer Podcast. I'll continue posting cool videos of the action that's happening on my site. Now, just before we get to today's guest, who's going to give us some tips on legal issues around property developments, I did a past episode on the legal side of developing. So if legals are your thing, then be sure to go back to episode 63, where I speak with solicitor Lewis O'Brien about some key considerations for developers before they sign contracts for large amounts of money. And he had this to say.
It's not hard to have a contract worth more than $500,000. I think it's worth spending a little bit of money talking to a solicitor who's got some experience in the area about, what can I do to make this a bit better? What might I think about? What special conditions should I insert? Those sorts of questions.
There's plenty of other great advice from Lewis in that chat, so be sure to re-listen to episode 63 of the Property Developer Podcast. Okay, on to today's guest. Kristy Muhlhan from Burke Associates Lawyers. Kristy is the head of their property law division, and she shares a wealth of tips and ideas about getting the legal side of property development in good shape. One of the traps that can catch people out in property development is avoiding spending money to get good advice, particularly before you enter into a contract that's worth a large sum of money, be that a land purchase or a construction contract. However, good upfront advice can avoid a lot of issues later down the track. And usually problems later means it's more messy and more expensive to fix. Anyway, in this chat, we discuss where property developers often come unstuck from a legal perspective, common legal structures that are used by developers, and some key tips to consider before entering into any joint venture agreements. I am sure you will enjoy this conversation about key legal considerations in property development. And we kicked off by finding out what Kristy would eat until she was sick.
Probably chocolate. Can't go past a good block of chocolate. And try not to have it every day, but definitely the favourite.
Any particular kind? The milk, the dark?
Oh, I think just anything I can get my hands on.
Yes, it's always nice to indulge in some really good chocolate. There's something special about it. It does something to the brain, doesn't it? It triggers something.
It does.
All right. Well, we're here today to talk property development as usual. And this time we're talking legals of property development. So you're the principal and director of the property law division at Burke Associates Lawyers. So can you give us a bit of a background of yourself, Kristy, how you got into law and then how you ended up focusing on the property side of things?
Yeah, sure. So I've been with the firm now for about 15 years, and I actually started out as a trainee legal secretary at the firm and on reception. And then I started studying online as a mature age student whilst working here full time, and got my degree, slowly worked my way up as a lawyer. And here I am as a principal. I've been a principal for almost 8 years now, and just recently got my accreditation as a property law specialist with the LIV.
And what does that mean? What does becoming a property law specialist actually entail, or what's the difference?
Yeah, so when you're a lawyer, you can't really make yourself out as a specialist in a particular practice area unless you have an accreditation. So the peak industry body in Victoria is the Law Institute of Victoria. And I did a few assessments this year to obtain my property specialisation. And so I got accredited only last month, actually.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
And so what are the kind of things that you focus on when you're doing those assessments that are different or beyond a general legal understanding?
Yeah, look, it's really quite broad. They're testing your knowledge on property law in general, which has, so many different facets. It includes conveyancing, property development, commercial leasing, property disputes, the tax considerations of property matters. So it's really quite broad. They're really trying to test your knowledge to see that your focus isn't just on one particular area, but you have a really broad understanding of property law in general. Because even if you're working with a property developer, for example, it can comprise so many different legal elements. It's not just you do property development. It's really broad what that entails.
Yeah, so we're going to cover that off because it is very broad. You're right. At the different points along the way, you have different legal requirements or things that you need to check off. But before we get to that, what was it that attracted you or drew you into focusing on property?
I think one of the main reasons I like property is, I suppose there's a bit of adrenaline associated with it. There's always a start and a finish to most property matters. So usually there'll be some sort of deadline involved. So you sort of work up to this deadline, and then it's a really good feeling when you sort of tick it off, you finish it, and you move on to the next project or matter, whatever it might be. So even though I also do some commercial work as well, property is very much just these tight sort of timelines, and you're always really focused on getting to that end goal and ticking the box, whereas a lot of the other work that you do can be quite ongoing and continues.
And so property development, tell us a bit about the kind of work that you would do with your clients in that sector.
Yeah, so property development, there's sort of different cycles or different elements involved with property development. So there's the acquisition stage where obviously property developers are looking to acquire property to undertake their property development. So that also involves, due diligence as part of that acquisition process, looking at structure, what's the best legal structure, are there any other parties involved or anything like that need to be a part of it. There's the planning phase in terms of making sure that the developer can undertake the project that they want to undertake, doing the planning due diligence, getting their planning approval through, sometimes ending up in VCAT to make sure that that happens and goes smoothly. Then you have the sort of off the plan sales process and getting those pre-sales through so that construction finance can go through, being involved in the conveyancing aspect when there's volume conveyancing and lots of off the plan sales. Then you have to do the settlements and subdivision. And along the way, you find that there's always some sort of dispute that might arise, with a builder, purchaser, or some other party. And then there's also getting all your consultancy agreements and commercial contracts in place. So it's quite a sort of wide scope of work that we do.
Yeah, it's funny hearing you say that, because when you're doing a property development project, there's a lot of people that come on to the team at various points along the way. But for a lot of consultants, there's a sort of fixed point of where they come and go, like at different cycles through the project.
Yeah.
And there's only a handful of people really on the team that's there from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, that's right.
And the legal people are one of those groups or one of those members of the team that generally are there from pre-project through almost to post-project when you're trying to wrap things up.
Yeah, that's right.
So I put together my own property developer training program, and one of the first groups of people that I suggest or advise people to get on board, legal people amongst that group. And one of the first people you want to try and find and get on the team.
Yeah. And I mean, there are always benefits to having us involved from the very beginning, because once decisions have been made, sometimes they're quite difficult to undo if they haven't been done correctly.
Yes, it's always easier to try and avoid problems than unscramble the egg. I've found that myself. So let's get stuck into, let's start off a little bit generally speaking. What are the kind of common issues or legal problems that you commonly see property developers getting themselves into?
One of the most common things that I see, which it happens so often, and it just surprises me time and time again, is when someone, particularly newer developers, when they're looking to acquire land, often they don't get legal advice at the outset in terms of the contract of sale and so on. They'll often sign the contract in their own right, so as an individual, or sometimes they might use, an existing company or trust that they already have in place. So they sign the contract. After signing the contract, they then realise, maybe I should get some tax advice or some structuring advice as to what entity I should use to complete the project. Now, between the date that they sign the contract, it might take 3-4 weeks to get a new company or trust, established to take over the project. They then nominate that new entity. And between that contract date and the nomination date, what a lot of developers don't actually realise is if they take any steps to develop the land, they could be imposed with double stamp duty. Land development is not physical land development, but is such a broad definition and it can merely include something like the developer engaging a surveyor to prepare a plan of subdivision. So they might sign the contract, engage a surveyor and say, prepare me a plan of subdivision, nominate a different entity 4 weeks later, and then all of a sudden SRO does an audit and they're stung with double stamp duty because they took that step of engaging the surveyor before they nominated that entity. So that's one of the really common things that we see. And we have seen property developers imposed with double stamp duty, even though it may have always been their intention to nominate another entity. So that's probably one of the really, important things that we try to tell property developers is get advice at the outset, don't do anything once you've bought the property until you know what you're doing, so that things don't go bad.
Yes, it's incredible how people just sort of forge ahead and forget about some of these key pieces that they need to put in place. But you've touched on structures there. So is that when you're talking to people about the kind of structures that they should wrap a project up in, what are the considerations that you would discuss with people?
Yeah, so structure really does depend on someone's personal circumstances and what they're trying to achieve from their development. So there's different sorts of property developers. Some people are sort of your one-time developer who, you know, it might be a mum and dad type scenario that they're just looking to develop their existing property and they may never develop again. You have your sort of family-run property developer businesses where, you know, there's benefits to having some flexibility in the structure for, you know, distributing income or profits so that it minimises tax. And then you have your sort of commercial developers where they're, you know, it could just be a commercial run business with, you know, one person in control essentially, or there might be numerous people involved in the business. And then if these people are all unrelated, you want to make sure that the structure is right. So, you know, who's in control of the development, who can make decisions, you know, who gets the profits and in what proportions, you know, what happens if there's a loss to the development, what happens there. And another critical issue is, particularly with larger developments, what happens if there's unsold stock at the end of the development and how does that get distributed between the parties? So there's all sorts of different structures, whether it's from individual, there's companies, there's unit trusts, discretionary trusts, and it really depends on what the parties are trying to achieve and who the parties are that are involved in the property development.
Yeah, so the other party or the other group that I suggest people get on board early, pre-project, is a good accountant.
Yes, definitely.
And oftentimes you will find if you ask the lawyer which structure or option to take, they'll give you one answer. Then if you talk to the accountant, they'll give you their perspective on what they think is the right option. So how do you balance those out, say in this particular instance, structures, because there's accounting and tax implications as well as legal. So how would you balance those questions out, or how do you get the team to work together in that early stage where you're laying your foundations?
Yeah, so look, we always try and work with the accountant, not against the accountant. The best way to achieve the best structure is really for there to be just open, transparent communication. Often we'll meet with the developer and the accountant at the same time so that we can talk through what the issues are and what they're trying to achieve. Otherwise, I mean, we would obviously give our recommendation from a legal perspective of what we think is wise, but we would always say, you know, you need to make sure that you get tax advice because there could be quite adverse tax implications, particularly with capital gains tax as well. So just balancing, you know, legal interest, tax interest, it is better when everybody comes together and we're all on the same page and we try and work through it together.
Yes, it's one of those situations where you kind of have to make some decisions based on your own circumstance in terms of what outcome you want to achieve. And sometimes there's a trade-off in that, whether you're trading off tax for more cash or whatever it might be. It's different for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose one of the important things is, you know, minimising liability and risk there as well, which is most property developers will set up a special purpose entity to complete a project to minimise that risk.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is a wise or sensible thing to do from a legal perspective?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, essentially, if you were purchasing a property in your own name, in your personal name, if there's a dispute along the way, whether that be with, you know, the builder or purchaser or whoever that might be, you're essentially at risk of being sued yourself, and then any assets that you own in your own name are also at risk of being taken, depending on what the outcome of that claim would be. So when we say set up a special purpose entity is to try and take that liability away from you as an individual and pass that liability onto a different entity. So that might be a company, it might be a trust, but provided that company or trust doesn't own any other assets, the liability is limited to what that legal entity owns itself. So there's obviously still a risk that claims might be brought, but the exposure is reduced because because of the confines of what that legal entity actually owns. And for example, with a company or trust, you can often take steps to wind it up after a project is completed as well. And once all the tax is dealt with and all of that, you can take steps to wind it up and move on.
Yeah, so I'm in the process of going through that at the moment with an entity that was used for a project, and it's sort of wrapped up. And so now it's time to close out the entity and pay tax and wind it all up.
Yes, yeah.
And then what about joint venture agreements? Because I know a lot of smaller developers, not even smaller, but particularly when people are getting started, they might realize that they need to bring in an investor, or they'll do a joint venture with somebody else or with a group of people. How would people go out approaching that, and why would they do that?
Yeah, so a joint venture is different to the legal structure. A joint venture is not typically a legal entity in its own right. So it's essentially an agreement. So there's all different types of joint ventures, and it really depends, again, on what the parties are trying to achieve. I suppose the most important thing is where parties are coming together is to do a bit of a risk assessment of what are they trying to achieve and what are the risks of entering into an agreement. So to give you a bit of an example, one question that we get asked is someone may own a property, they may be approached by a developer to develop their land. What are the implications of that? Well, for the landowner themselves, they're not going to have to pay any additional stamp duty. But where the developer is developing someone else's land, they're taken to have an interest in the property or an economic entitlement. And so if we were acting for that developer, it would be crazy for them to be developing someone else's land without a proper agreement in place, because they will be paying stamp duty even if they're never registered on title. So that's a really important consideration. What's the party's involvement? Something like that could be avoided by the landowner engaging a project manager for services rather than entering into a development agreement, so that there's no, additional stamp duty there. So that's not so much a risk for the landowner, but it's more a risk for the person developing the land there.
Yeah, and I think when you're starting out or when you're smaller, there's a temptation to want to avoid spending money on advice, going to the accountant or going to the lawyer and asking for advice and for an agreement to be drawn up. Is that something that you see very often?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do see that all the time. But I suppose from our perspective, we also see when things go bad along the way. So in my view, it's definitely worth the investment at the outset to make sure everything's set up properly, because if you don't get that advice at the start, 9 times out of 10, you'll end up spending more money along the way because it hasn't been done properly. So, and again, coming back to joint ventures, depending on the legal structure, there's all different types of agreements that can be entered into, depending what that legal structure is and who the parties are.
Yeah, I think that's a trap for the younger player trying to avoid some costs that are probably, that are a worthwhile investment. I guess, as you touched on, sometimes spending money to avoid having bigger problems down the track is very worthwhile investment to make.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let's talk about contracts. What's your view on using, again, this touches on investing in things being drawn up for you. There's quite often there'll be industry contracts that you could use, standard sort of format contracts versus tailored contracts. What's your view on that? When would you use this, like a standard industry one versus a tailored one?
So this question probably relates to sales contracts, but also to construction contracts, which are probably, similar in some regards. So you have your industry body sort of standard contract. So let's talk about a sales contract. You'll have your standard general conditions in your sales contract. I would recommend using that standard contract because in the property industry, everyone is well versed on what those conditions are. Having said that, 9 times out of 10 with property developments, I would say that the general conditions are not enough for a property development project. So that needs to be enhanced by adding some special conditions that are tailored to the specific project. So I don't think there's any harm in using standard contracts, but they always have to be tailored in some respect to make sure that you're considering the particular circumstances of the development and, again, what the parties are trying to achieve. So it's just a bit of a balancing act there. And I suppose one of the common things we see is people think that a standard contract is standard, so it's okay. But often, it's the particulars that are not completed correctly, or, it just might be something minor that the party who's signing isn't aware of. And if the contracts aren't completed correctly, then there's a problem. So they need to be, done properly.
Yeah, and I always say to people, you just need to be aware of who drafted the contract in terms of if it's an industry. If it's their contract, well, it's probably likely to favour them. So if it's a kind of building or housing industry type body that did the contract, well, you can be pretty sure that it's going to favour the builder. And so just be aware of that when you're using them.
That's right.
And then construction contracts. I guess this is always a good one. Is it the same thing? You'd use a industry one but get it checked, or do you draw up individual
really
ones?
Is the same thing. So again, it depends on what's the scope of the contract. It's all in the fine print of what's in the contract. So yes, there's standard terms there that provide some protections to the consumer or the developer. Yes, they're in the standard contract, but is the detail of what the scope of the construction should be, has that been inserted into the standard form contract? So just to give you an example, is the builder providing all the appliances for the apartments that it's building, or would the developer have to go to its own expense following construction? It's just those little things that are really important to make sure that they're in the contract. It's also important to check who the parties are and, do some due diligence, make sure that the builder is correctly recorded and that they are registered, make sure that the builder has appropriate insurance in place and so on. So it's just checking the finer details of it.
Yes. It's funny how you can overlook some of those things along the way. What about disputes? What are the common disputes that you tend to see during developments?
Probably the most common sorts of disputes are with purchasers. It might be a simple thing as a purchaser's not ready to settle on a contract. Once settlement is called, once a plan of subdivision has registered and the occupancy permit has issued, they may not have finance in place and they may just want an extension. So that may not be a dispute as such. We would call it a bit of a contractual dispute because the purchaser is not in a position to settle on the due date of settlement. And then obviously the parties have to work through that. But I suppose one of the really common ones that happens with purchasers is when there's amendments to the plan of subdivision, and particularly something like a reallocation of a car park. So we often see this in plans of subdivision. There might not be any changes in, the size of a car park, but it might just be that some of the lot numbers get switched and someone ends up with a car park in a different location to what they thought they were getting. So something like that, may not be a concern, but it may also be a concern. So a purchaser has a right to end the contract if there's a material change to a plan of subdivision. So it all comes down to, is it a material change? And I mean, there's certainly case law out there to say that a reallocation of a car park can amount to a material change, because it really depends on the purchaser's personal circumstances. For example, if the purchaser had a disability and needed to be on the ground floor level, then that could amount to a material change. So definitely a lot of correspondence and dispute around changes to a plan of subdivision. Doesn't necessarily mean that, it will end up in VCAT or anything like that, but there's often, quite a bit of negotiation going on where there are changes.
What about project renders versus reality?
Yes.
Can you get into trouble there?
Again, I suppose partly comes down to what's in the contract. So definitely want to make sure that you have architectural plans, renders in your contract of sale without specific measurements on them. When you're signing an off the plan contract, you're relying on the plan of subdivision, not the architectural drawing. So where there's a scale or measurement on a floor plan, for example, that will probably cause a dispute if, upon completion, it doesn't reflect that floor plan. So, I mean, we would recommend that any sort of measurements, renders, floor plans, etc., be kept separate to the contract of sale and form part of the marketing material, so that there's no dispute about what's actually in the contract of sale. So it's just being careful about where you're producing those plans.
Actually, it just made me think of a question that I wanted to ask you, was about the length of contracts. Some of these things, they're like 60 to 100 pages, but then when you actually read through them, it's only like 4 or 5 pages of it that are actually really relevant.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So, I mean, a contract for sale, they've got certain elements to them. You have your particulars of sale, you have your general condition, that's all relatively standard. Then you have your special conditions. So it's really important to know what's in those special conditions. Then you have your plan of subdivision if it's an off the plan contract of sale, which has to be included. I mean, that distinguishes what you're actually purchasing as a purchaser. You have your architectural plans, you usually have specifications, again, if it's off the plan. And then you have your vendor statement. Now, the vendor statement is interesting because for a property development, you're essentially disclosing, certain things about the property in its current state. You're not talking about the development upon completion. So in large part, a lot of what you read in that vendor statement may not be relevant to a purchaser because it might have an owner's corporation budget in there to show them what fees may be payable upon completion, may have owner's corporation rules and some other elements that they can use. But in large part, it's really telling you about the property in its current state. So to come back to your question, yes, they are long. I mean, some off the plan contracts are 300 pages plus, but I think everything that's included in them needs to be in there most of the time.
Yeah, it's funny because there's always sort of 3 or 4 pages that are particularly important, the ones where you sign or you write the contract sum or the sales price. And then there's just all this other stuff in there that you glaze over as you scan through it all.
And I suppose from time to time, we do see contracts where you look through them and you think to yourself, why have these extra pages been included? They're really not relevant and they're actually not required.
Yes, sometimes you have to go back and look through a contract, which is usually never a good sign when you're having to go back and check through and you start reading things going, oh, that is actually in the contract there that something has to be done by this date or this amount of time, or you've got this obligation that you need to meet.
Yes.
All right. And then what about planning disputes? You touched on VCAT just before. What role would a solicitor or lawyer then play if you choose to appeal that decision by council?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, often with planning disputes, town planners are nearly always involved, and they liaise with the councils and so on in terms of trying to achieve what you want in the planning permit. Ultimately, if you can't get that planning approval, the position is to take it to VCAT. Obviously, taking it to VCAT doesn't mean it will be successful either. So there needs to be some consideration what the merits of the appeal are, to consider whether, there is likelihood of success. You don't want to be appealing a decision, going to VCAT, spending all that money, and essentially delaying the project if the ultimate outcome will be that you're not going to get what you want to get anyway. So usually it's a bit of collaboration between lawyers, town planners, other consultants get involved in the process as well. But the main point would be to assess the position at the outset before taking steps to go to VCAT. And that may include, for example, looking at other cases in the same municipality to see whether the likelihood of success, is going to be in your favour.
Yes, I've experienced a failed trip to the planning tribunal, and it's not fun spending all that time and money and not getting a result.
And I think that's right. I mean, it's not just about the money. There's significant time involved. There's significant delays involved. So part of the assessment needs to be, if you've been approved for, say, 10 lots and you're trying to get 12 lots, is it worth that time and money? You need to take a step back and consider what your goals are, what you're trying to achieve, and also look at the feasibility of it as well. I mean, if you're incurring those additional costs, is the development still feasible, and will you get the profits that you want to make?
Yes, very, very true. Actually, a timely question for you. We've got escalating build costs at the moment quite significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hearing a lot, and I've experienced this myself, builders coming back asking for more money to complete projects. What's your advice in that situation? Because most people just throw up their hands and go, "Oh, we're not paying any more money. We've got a contract price," which may lead to a builder going bust or stopping work. But what's your advice for people who might be in that situation at the moment?
I mean, it really comes back to what are the terms of the contract? What is the scope of the contract? What is the builder's ability, to make changes to things, to materials, to supplies, to fixtures, to fittings, all of that. It really comes back to, I suppose there's no one size fits all answer here. It's what contract has been used, what's in the contract, what's the scope in terms of what the builder's obligations are, what they have to use. Because at the end of the day, if it's not in the contract, then the builder probably has a right to vary that or request a variation if they're needing to do something, which would come at an additional expense. So it really depends on what it is that the builder is talking about, and what the contract says.
Yes, well, it's interesting that we talk about having contracts and what's in the contract. But in my experience, you can have the very best contracts drawn up by the very best people. But when someone says, "I'm not doing something," you're sort of stuck in this difficult situation where you have to weigh up what you're going to do. You can choose to take legal action, but it's timely, costly. You're going to get a better outcome than a negotiated one anyway. It's kind of, I just find it a bit weird sometimes that you find yourself in that situation.
That's right. And I mean, it is a bit of a balancing act because if the builder's in breach of the contract, there are certain steps that can be taken in that regard, but that could amount to more costs, more delays, etc. So is it better to go down that dispute path, or is it better to seek a resolution, come to some agreement essentially to vary that contract to meet the builder, where the builder wants to be, or perhaps come to a compromise somewhere in between?
Yes, more often than not, it's better just to negotiate some kind of outcome rather than end up in a dispute where probably no one's going to be really happy at the end of the day.
Definitely, yeah.
And Kristy, what about choosing legal advice? How would you go about finding someone suitable to work with you or to partner with you?
Mhm. I think that it's important to find someone who has experience in the area, knows your industry, knows your goals and what you want to achieve, but also someone that you can, have a good relationship with, have rapport with, and know that they're on the other end of the line if you need help with something. So I suppose the thing that we find with property developers is when something goes wrong, something has happened then and there, and they need help then and there. They can't wait, a couple of days or a week or 2 weeks to get that legal advice. It's often that they just need to phone someone and get that advice on the spot. So that's something that I suppose we like to show, is that we are here, we're available. If something happens, the lawyer is on the other end of the line. You're not going to be talking to the receptionist or administrative staff. We have lawyers who are available. We know the industry quite well. There's usually someone here that would be able to assist. So it's really just finding a lawyer who knows the industry and who's available.
Actually, do you see many lawyers getting involved themselves in doing projects? Or are they scared off by all the things they've seen?
I haven't myself, but I must say that it's always in the back of my mind that, to be a better lawyer, at some point in time, I think I will undertake a property development. So I obviously see the property development project, the whole cycle from the legal perspective. And, I'm involved quite a bit with property developers, but actually being on site, dealing with consultants, that's a different element that I haven't been involved in. So to answer your question, no, I haven't seen lawyers involved, but I myself am definitely keen to undertake my own property development projects just to see things from the other perspective.
What kind of project would you take on? What would be...
What kind of project? Look, I think it would probably be something small, a small townhouse development or something like that. But yeah, I think just to try to understand it from a property developer's perspective.
Yes, you have to go through a project to understand all the unique elements along the way that you have to deal with. Yeah, would be helpful. One final question for you. Planning can be challenging, getting through planning. Do you have any advice on whether that's going to get easier, whether it's going to get harder, how you would recommend people approach that so they can get their permits and keep their projects moving?
Yeah, sure. So, one of the things that we often see is, acquiring a property with a really long settlement time frame, getting special conditions put into the contract so that they can go through that planning process before they've actually settled on the land. So, if they can get to the point where they have a planning approval in place before settlement has actually taken place, then once settlement occurs, they're in a really good position to, actually commence construction or tender builders and so on. So they've sort of fast-tracked the process, if you like, and they don't have those same holding costs because they haven't been holding the property. So having said that, obviously there's probably a limited market for doing that. So it really comes down to, liaising with agents, talking to people in the industry. It might be that you're paying slightly above market value to get those conditions in the contract, but is it worth paying that additional sum in order to get that extended settlement period and get your planning approval through so that you don't have those additional holding costs?
Yes, very true. What's the best piece of advice that you've ever been given, Kristy?
The best piece of advice? Wow, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure how to answer that one. I think for me, it's just if you want to achieve something, if you have a goal in mind, make it happen. So that what's stopping you, you can always get to where you want to get to. You just need to, I suppose, have a bit of faith in yourself and plan for it, work through that process to achieve your goals. So don't let anything stand in your way. If you want to achieve something, make it happen.
And what about your top tip or piece of advice for developers out there who might be looking to take their business to the next level?
Yeah, so anyone looking to take their business to the next level, again, I think it all comes back to planning and what's the strategy behind taking your business to the next level? What are the goals that you want to achieve? You really need to make sure that you plan for it and don't rush into it. So again, that might involve getting legal advice, getting tax advice. If you're taking it to the next level, what does that look like? Does that mean a bigger development project? Does that mean taking on, employees, staff to make it easier, to make it a bigger venture? Or what does that mean? So it really comes back to that individual's business, their plan, their strategy, what they want to achieve.
Yes, very good advice. All right. Well, where can people find out more about you or about the company if they're interested?
Yeah, sure. So website, burkelawyers.com.au, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. Look us up. Feel free to contact me directly. Happy to hear from you.
What's on the Instagram feed? Photos of contracts?
No. Good question, actually. We have our 12 days of Christmas at the moment. Bit of everything, sharing what our team's doing here.
Oh, very good. I'll have to start following you on Instagram. All right. Any last requests for the listeners of the show?
Just feel free to give me a call. No obligation. If you want to have a chat, find out how we can help you. More than happy to have a discussion. No obligation. Feel free to reach out.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. I'll finish by saying finding a good legal person to be in your corner is a very important strategic piece in not just a development. I think for a property developer to have that trusted advisor in their corner makes a massive difference. So thank you for coming on the show, talking to us about legals. They're always of interest. There's so many legal elements to a property development, but if you play your cards right, hopefully they're never really too much of a factor. So thanks for being on the show and sharing all your insights with us.
No problem. Thanks, Justin.
See you later.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.